Russian mercenary fighters have broken into the Bakhmut Citadel and are fighting their way in building by building. Russian forces have also captured the high rises that made up the Ukrainian positions holding down the southern flank of town. Meanwhile, Ukraine is potentially running into trouble that could ruin the prospects of their offensive. Between a wet spring season and equipment losses during the winter campaign, the Ukrainian government has been signaling to the media to lower their expectations for a successful offensive, and Zelensky himself has made the statement that the situation on the front might not be ideal for offensive operations, and rather than take heavy losses, Ukraine might be forced to postpone this operation. First, we will start with the situation in Bakhmut. Recent drone footage of the area has shown that the battlefield is very cloudy, meaning there has probably been some rainfall over the last couple of days in the area. This once again could complicate Ukraine's supply situation, making them once again unable to use the fields and have to stick to the roads in order to move ammo and reinforcements both in and out of the city. The Russian forces in the last 48 hours have managed to break through and capture some Ukrainian positions and gain a foothold on others. There are three lines of attack that have resulted in gains for the Russians. But before we look into those, I just want to give a quick reminder to everyone to hit the like and subscribe buttons, actions that are totally free for you but are a big help for me to grow the channel. And I would like to give a special thanks to Chris for the super chat. I really appreciate this kind of support. The first area we're going to look at is the northern face of the Citadel area. One of the factors that makes this position so strong is that there are very strongly built apartment buildings facing the north and the west of the Citadel area, and they pretty much cover all of the different angles of approach. They are essentially acting as walls with hundreds of firing points for the Ukrainians. This is a big reason why Russian forces have had trouble with these positions over the last week or so. We finally got word last night that the Russians gained a foothold by attacking straight up Livanovskogo Street, which is the main road that dissects through the center of the Citadel. This is a very bold area to attempt an advance, but somehow the Russians managed to capture 2 to 2.5 of the residential high rises in this sector. If the Ukrainians do not attempt to force the Russians back away from these buildings, then the Russians will be able to reinforce and start island hopping from building to building until the Ukrainians are completely forced out of the city. Slightly to the south of this position, the Russians have also managed to cross Chakhovskogo Street in a second location, capturing the high-rise that holds down the corner of the Citadel. The most recent reports from the area suggest the Russians are now moving up through the long buildings that run parallel to the street and are attempting to move into the next building directly to the west. If the Russians achieve capturing some firing positions on Volitsia Street, then they will be able to completely cut communications between the Citadel and the southern defense. This particular line of attack is actually the shortest to the far western border of town, which is just a couple hundred meters from the current Russian position. So far, I've listed out these updates in order of concern or severity for the Ukrainian army. The crossing at Livanovskogo Street is bad, but it has the potential to be contained, and the crossing of Chakhovskogo Street could have dire consequences, but it's also a small bridgehead and could be contained. I want to emphasize the word could because that doesn't mean that they will be. I'm just simply saying that the Ukrainians have potential to force the Russians back in these locations as of now. But the last update is a bit more troublesome for the Ukrainian defenders. To the south of the city, the Ukrainian army has lost the position of the high-rise apartment complex, which is near to the MiG-17 statue. And they've also lost much of the surrounding residential area. these positions are probably going to be very difficult to recapture. Some of these buildings have been completely leveled over the last couple of weeks, but some are still standing and make excellent firing positions for the Russians to use and to further advance from. From this area, Russia can very easily isolate this part of town and defeat the Ukrainians here in detail. I do also have an update from the northern flank of town, which is, I guess, on the next slide. That's just, going back real quick just to give you guys an overall picture of Bakhmut, where you can see the three different locations where the Russians are pushing forward, and you can start to see why I believe this final one to be the most concerning, because if the Russians had the ability to move through here, they could completely sever these two different areas and cut the lines of communication between the two. So, that could result in the Russians capturing essentially this whole southern part of town and then having another path to try and cut this final Ukrainian road here. So this isn't a good development. I think that's why I had this slide in here, but we'll go ahead and advance to the flank where the trench warfare is going on. The Russians have managed to capture another trench line and another defensive position. They haven't yet crossed the road here, but this is dangerous because every step that the Russians move in this direction, this is over the crest of a hill, and this gives the Russians better and better visibility of the ground below and potentially more direct lines of sight over these Ukrainian logistic routes that lead into this part of Bakhmut. So, while this is a small gain for the Russian side, it is rather concerning. And we are also getting reports of Ukrainian counterattacks in this area here, so I don't really have information on the moment or information that I consider to be very accurate to confirm what those look like, but just keep in mind that at any given point in time, these lines don't look exactly what they look like in these videos I make for you guys. All right, so real quick, moving to the southern flank of Bakhmut, there is a development here, a good development for the Ukrainian side. They have launched a counterattack and recaptured another large chunk of territory that the Russians have occupied for several months now, that is west of the canal. So the Russians do still have some positions west of the canal, but for the most part, they did have a pretty good bridgehead that extended along this entire area here originally, right? So they, had this quarry and they had positions in this forest here. And I apologize. I know this is on the edge of the screen for you guys, so real quick I'll move that over. I always forget there's actually a button here to erase everything. I'm kind of dumb that I never see that's there. But the Russians previously had something like this and have lost it over the last couple of months, chunk by chunk. The Ukrainians have just been recapturing some of it. First was the forested areas, then was the quarry area, and then they captured several fields here in this area, and then here recently they captured a big chunk, and there's perhaps even fighting on the opposite bank of the canal, but I don't really have any confirmation of that or any advances made by the Ukrainians there. So there is talk that this is a pretty serious counterattack, but it's not a lot of ground. This is, it's the same talk when you're here and there's pretty serious Russian attacks on the flanks that result in a couple square kilometers of gains. Sometimes they're pretty big attacks. Sometimes they're just local attacks. From what I've seen, this is a local Ukrainian attack on what appears to be some weaker Russian positions. So I'll give you, once I get more information on the situation, I'll give you guys an update, especially if it develops more. Some people are saying that this flank is going to collapse. I'm not seeing the evidence for that as of yet. So there are three concerning developments that might affect the successful outcome of a planned Ukrainian offensive. Two of them are caused by the Russians, and one is a bit more natural. The natural event is a spring rainy season that seems to be lasting longer than usual in the area. For the Ukrainian side, this is an unfortunate weather development that might force them to delay for several weeks beyond whatever the planned launch date was. Now, I speculated that the planned launch date was probably going to be in early June. A lot of people have been saying for 3 or 4 weeks now that Ukraine was going to launch this offensive imminently, similar to how I've been saying for several months now that Bakhmut was probably going to fall, right? So, like, we're all really bad at predicting things. And of course, both the Russians and Ukrainians are pretty good or getting pretty good at information warfare and hiding their intentions, and keeping throwing everyone for a loop on this sort of thing. So the suggestion is that if Ukraine was going to launch their offensive in early June, the rainy season is lasting longer than expected, it might force them to hold off until July, or possibly even August if summer, if things continue the way they're going. So that is potentially a problem for Ukraine. And you have some recent statements by the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, where he's basically saying that, not verbatim, but to summarize what he said, is they have the equipment and the troops to do it now, but the current situation on the battlefield isn't that favorable. So if they were to launch it now, they would sustain very heavy casualties, and it might be better to wait for a more opportune time at some other point in the summer, which is honestly very, like, it's not a surprising statement to make, and it's the kind of thing that most people should be able to understand. You don't want to telegraph and say when exactly you're going to do something, because that is going to result in heavy casualties, right? And Ukraine has been saying for several weeks that they're going to launch an offensive in the early summer, or late spring, so in this May-June area. And I've always been skeptical from the beginning that they were going to do exactly what they were telling the public that they were going to do, because there's a huge amount of risk in that, right? And of course, this is probably information operation that for some reason, that they're doing for some rhyme or reason. So, perhaps, and something I've speculated on this before, perhaps it's to prevent the Russians from launching their own offensive. The last two offensives that Ukraine launched worked out very well for them. Probably has the Russians thinking twice about a lot of the stuff that they're doing. Of course, the Russians have a lot of reserves available right now, and from recent video we've seen, it appears like they have plenty of armored equipment available as well. So maybe they wanted to launch an offensive in May. Ukraine caught wind of it, started saying that no, we're going to launch an offensive. That has the Russians thinking, well, maybe because they surprised us the last two times, we should just hold off on ours, wait to see what the Ukrainians are going to do, and then do ours after. So there could be a lot of different reasons for doing this, right? So but one potential issue with the Ukrainians delaying their offensive is it gives the Russians more time to prepare and to discover the Ukrainian plan, and whether that's through espionage or more press leaks, whatever. But it also gives the Russians more time to keep doing what they're currently doing. So the Russians are targeting Ukraine's self-propelled artillery along with other equipment to a devastating effect. Russian Lancet kamikaze drones have come back to the battlefield with a vengeance. Although Ukraine has improved their anti-drone and anti-air defense capabilities, there doesn't seem to be an answer for the Lancet drone. Self-propelled artillery is vital for successful offensive actions. The ability for these vehicles to fire off a couple of rounds to support an attack and then load up and move in a matter of seconds means that by the time the artillery position is detected by a counter battery radar, the vehicle is already long gone and possibly even already firing from its next position. The ability to shoot, scoop, and keep shooting is vital to keep up artillery support of assault units on the front line without the threat of losing your own batteries. Unfortunately for the Ukrainians, they have already lost a number of newly arrived M109 Paladins. So, since last fall, Ukraine has received a number of these self-propelled artillery pieces, 67 of which were of the M109 howitzer type. So they've also received some other stuff, of course, like the French Caesars and Swedish archers and Polish crabs and other things of that type of make. But of the M109 howitzer, that's the American variant of self-propelled artillery. They've had 3 or 4 different variants actually sent to them from different NATO partners. So they're all built by the American defense industry. Just different variants are sent to different countries. So according to the Oryx blog, which I believe has some serious accuracy problems of its own, but we don't really have time to get into that. But between the time frame of the 4th of November and the 28th of April, the Russians have destroyed or damaged 21 of these pieces of equipment alone. So that's just the M109 howitzers. That's not considering Polish crabs or other self-propelled guns. So, and that is also not including the entries that didn't make it into the blog. So situations where these pieces of equipment were destroyed, we got video of it, they're not present in the blog, like we've searched for them and haven't seen them, or pieces that have been destroyed in the last 15 days, of which there are several. Mixed in with the downed M109 howitzers, the Lancet kamikaze drones have taken out a number of other pieces of propelled artillery, including Polish crabs, 2 S1 Gvozdikas, and 2 S3 Akatsias. So if Ukraine is going to conduct a successful offensive operation, they must find a way to slow the destruction of their self-propelled artillery and neutralize the threat of the Lancet drones. The final issue Ukraine is running into is successful Russian jamming of HIMARS missiles. This is a bit of information, actually surprisingly, that is coming from CNN. Now, the Russians have been claiming that these capabilities for several months now it's something that they've been able to do, but for the first time we have a mainstream news outlet quoting the U.S. Government officials that have been briefed on this. So just really quickly, just the first paragraph here: Russia has been thwarting U.S.-made mobile rocket systems in Ukraine more frequently in recent months, using electronic jammers to throw off its GPS-guided targeting system to cause rockets to miss their targets. Multiple people briefed on the matter told CNN. Ukrainian military officials, with U.S. help, have had to come up with a variety of different workarounds as it continues to use the high mobility artillery rocket system, that's HIMARS, which has been perhaps the most revered and feared piece of weaponry in Ukraine's fight. The medium-range rocket systems were hailed as a game-changer in the conflict and have played a key role since the moment they arrived on the battlefield last summer, including in last year's offensive that allowed Ukraine to take back significant swaths of territory from Russia. But in recent months, the systems have been rendered increasingly less effective by Russia's intensive blocking. 5 U.S., British, and Ukrainian sources tell CNN, forcing the U.S. and Ukrainian officials to find ways to tweak the HIMARS software to counter the evolving Russian jamming efforts. So, definitely a pretty big deal. HIMARS was the weapon that made the capture of the Kherson region even possible for Ukraine. With it, the Ukrainians were able to launch precision strikes on large Russian fuel and ammo depots, starving the Russian front lines of supplies, and most pivotally, they were able to continuously disable the bridges across the Dnieper River, which isolated Russian troops. And then eventually it was decided by the Russian High Command that it was more dangerous to hold on to the opposite bank of the Dnieper River, and they retreated to the other side. So without HIMARS, the Ukrainians will have to find other means to target Russian logistics. Some evidence shows that they are already doing this with drone attacks on Russian oil refineries, but these are very large targets hit by slow-moving drones deep behind the front. They're neither as fast or accurate as a HIMARS missile. So the clear path for Ukraine to solve their HIMARS problem is to target these Russian electronic warfare systems, but that is way easier said than done. The Russian electronic warfare is also known to disrupt precision-guided Excalibur artillery cells and JDAM bombs, which are the American version of the Russian glide bomb. They're being used to great effect, but so far it appears only for the Russian side. So Ukraine doesn't have much precision weaponry to go after these electronic warfare systems that isn't already being affected by the jamming. Now, finally, I will close out the video by giving you guys a full view of the front lines with labels on all of the areas that have seen assault actions over the last 48 hours. Of course, here there is one that stands out from the others. You have the Russian assaults around Bakhmut. You have the Ukrainian counterattacks around Bakhmut as well. But you have one icon far to the north. That's actually in the area, well, it's very close to Belgorod and Kharkiv, and that's the area, the border area of Volchansk. There's a report from Ukrainian Ministry of Defense that there was a small arms fire and infantry maneuvers going on in that area. So if we, hear anything interesting from there, we will report on it in the next video. But that's it. Thank you guys for joining, and until next time.